Let's begin our webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is Greg Kim. I don't know if you can see me, probably not, which is probably a good thing. I'm one of the co-founders of Business Law Corps, which is a nonprofit, Hawaii nonprofit. We formed about 10 years ago. Me and Tashner, who's a co-founder, started it. And the idea of Law Corps is to focus on helping entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses get off the ground and grow and ultimately create jobs for our community. And so I think that's especially relevant these days with all that's happened the past year and many businesses failing, people losing their jobs. So we thought we'd like to organize this series of webinars beginning today with Ryan Hugh to go over the what you need to do to start a business. And we're trying to make this super practical, not say things that would require you to then hire a lawyer to do something. We want to give you the tools to actually do it. And of course, maybe eventually you'll have to hire a lawyer, but at least you'll be ahead of the game that way. Ryan is a corporate attorney. He's been practicing in Hawaii for a long time. I've known Ryan, I think, for many years. Well, I'm many years old, right? So everything for me now is many years, but I've known Ryan for a long time, and he's got a great reputation for helping entrepreneurs and small businesses. He's very active in the industry, which is good for his clients because he knows a lot of people. And you want to hire an attorney that is that way. I mean, that might be even a separate webinar, is how do you choose an attorney when you're a business, right? I think that his fee structure is very reasonable, and so he can work with smaller businesses, which believe me, that's not easy to do, especially if you hire a big law firm. You know, they usually have a really high cost structure. And so I think Ryan has really been a champion for small business and entrepreneurs for many years. He has his JD MBA from Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and his Bachelor of Arts from University of Pennsylvania, Punahou School graduate. And I think I'll turn it over to Ryan, and feel free to ask questions during the webinar. You can do that by putting it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I would want to disclose to you that this webinar is being recorded for future purposes, for educational purposes. And so if you do speak or you do start your video, it may be part of the recording. So I just want to let you know that. So with that being said, if I could turn it over to Ryan, and he'll begin his presentation on choosing your legal entity. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for the awesome introduction. It's been great knowing you all these years. Just for a plug for Business Law Corps, Greg and Kat started the idea of business attorneys being able to give back to the public by supporting entrepreneurs, startups, and business owners who here, as we know in Hawaii, a vast portion of them are mom and pop and small business owners struggling to deal with operating in a very high cost state. So the thought was that for business attorneys, you know, there are other ways that we can help out other than the more traditional routes of pro bono. So Greg has definitely spearheaded more access to justice in terms of helping out distressed business owners and kind of offering things like today's webinar for Restart Hawaii. So we thank Greg for organizing, well, Greg and Kat, but Kat will be in the next webinar. About that note, this is one of an 8-part series. So next week, Greg and Kat will actually be focusing more on as kind of a follow-up how to actually form your legal entity. Today's topic is very generalized and very kind of broad strokes, but it's wise for a business owner to kind of understand the lay of the land before they kind of jump in and understand the different business entities that you have as a choice. So,
Ryan, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention there are 8 webinars, one a week, except we skip one Friday or one Thursday, sorry. And the way we structured it is it's the sequence you'd go through if you needed to start a business. So that's how we thought about it. So the first step is, well, what do you form? You know, and Ryan's going to help you with that, and hopefully, you know, you can make a good choice there. And then the next one, well, how do you form it? right? And then the next question is, well, do you own your name? I mean, that's sort of a subset of the first two, but you know, how do you know that you own your name? Because that's usually important for people. And then it goes on into, you know, getting help from the state, hiring employees or contractors, um, signing a lease. How do you do that? So anyway, we tried to make it super practical for all of you and not your typical like legal seminar. We're trying to give you the tools you need to perhaps not have to hire any of us. So hopefully, or at least not hire us very much. So Brian, for mentioning that.
Yeah. So obviously check back. I very much consider this webinar and then Greg and Kat's next week very much a part of each other. So I think it'd be wise after you guys are done with this one is considering signing up for next week as kind of a follow-up to today's discussion. With regard to today's discussion, Greg was asking how I like to take questions. I like to talk story. I find business law can be very dry and boring and doesn't always lend itself to something that's readily understandable for most lay people. And so ask me a question when I'm on a slide, but usually let me get through the slide first. And then also, if we have time remaining at the end of the hour, I'm happy to take questions then. But I'm glad Greg mentioned checking your name as one of the kind of starting points. So you'll discover the business formation process. There's a lot of things happening for a new business owner all at once, and obviously the business world can move extremely fast. I experienced a situation on Clubhouse. If you don't know what that is, it's a new social media app where it's audio only, and you kind of drop in, and it's kind of a replacement in some ways for what we're missing now because of the pandemic is conventions. But I experienced a situation where a lady was talking about her business idea, and by the end of the chat, somebody had registered her domain name and her business name already, and was kind of trolling her, which was kind of unfortunate. So yes, things move very fast in the business world, and you may find that the topic we talked about this week, what Greg and Kat talks about next week, and on some of the other marketing weeks are kind of all decisions you're making contemporaneously at the same time. That being said, what I would warn you, especially those of you who are thinking of partnering up with your business or trying to make deals at the same time, and a lot of my interactions tend to be marketing and consultant types who, in my estimation, like to put the cart before the horse. Is they're more focused on making their business cards or their logos, and I'm like, no, you need to focus at selecting the proper kind of business entity to house your business operations before you get out to marketing. Is you might want to slow down and kind of roadmap about what key decisions you need to make as you go along the business process. And for us attorneys, usually it's the choice of your legal entity. And that's kind of why today is the kind of capstone in starting. So before we jump into the meat of the matter, just typical lawyer disclaimers that this is informational, even though it says, you know, our intent here is to kind of roadmap and kind of have you kind of do mostly everything yourselves. If you do find that you get into a very specific or dicey situation and you need specific legal advice, that's kind of when you turn to an attorney. But yes, as Greg said, the webinars are meant and designed to kind of help business owners make decisions on their own and giving you the tools or tips to kind of hopefully do as much without attorney aid, because things can get costly and pricey at that. So just though remember is that everything is information. I believe Greg has given you a chapter I kind of wrote, which Greg hopes to kind of package all 8 webinars and our content into a book. But I believe he's already given you materials, and that's what today's presentation was mostly based off of. So jumping down, today's agenda is done the introduction. I'm going to run through factors about what you should be thinking in your head when you're trying to select a appropriate legal entity for your business, or how to think about it. And then usually frequently, when it comes to business entities or business organizations, the key phrase for most attorneys in this area is limited liability, and how that impacts the business owner and their personal assets versus the business. So we'll spend a slide on that. And usually, if this is your first time owning a business or your first time exposure to business law, that is a concept that sometimes some people struggle to get with. So maybe that would be a good time for questions. And then after that, I'm going to run through the basic types of business organizations that you would kind of consider of how to run your business, or what you would select based on those factors earlier. Finally, towards the end, I have, in my experience, there are kind of frequently asked questions because I assist a lot of times people forming their business entity and structuring it. I get a lot of questions related to converting a business entity, other types of business entities, and then the should I form my business entity in Nevada, Wyoming, or Delaware kind of question. Even though I'm a Hawaii-based attorney, I sometimes get that question. After I go through that, hopefully we can land on the recap chart, and then we'll have extra time for more questions, because I'm sure if this is your first time launching a business, a lot of this will be very new, and I'm sure you'll have follow-up questions. Sound good, everybody? On that note, I believe Greg and Christian and Stefanos is monitoring the chat. So go ahead and type your questions into the chat, and they'll grab me. What you guys are not seeing on my screen, I wish I could share the whole thing, is I have multiple windows open, and sometimes I can get distracted. So please, I do urge you to interact and ask questions.
Yeah, if you'd like to unmute yourself and speak, you can also do that, but chat would also be a good option. So either way.
The reason why so huge dork video gamer, that's why I have the video game type of headsets for Twitch streaming, if you know what that is or whatnot. So I'm used to having lots of information on my double screens kind of streaming at me. So yeah, do whatever it takes to kind of flag yourself and ask your questions, please. I sometimes get tired of talking, so like I said, feel free. But with that being said, so just introduction again, just to map this out. Today's discussion is merely on how to decide what's the appropriate legal entity or business entity for your business. Usually the goal for most business owners is to minimize risk, and that's why we're gonna talk a little bit about limited liability and how that works. And then we are gonna touch upon things like taxes, structure, but for the most part, a lot of the conversation about how to form, again, will be next week with Greg and Kat. So just remember, today's topic is a little bit more broad and wide stroke. So what are the factors to consider when organizing a business? And obviously this is going to be a very heavily lawyer approach. And so we need some kind of vocabulary or kind of tool sets or factors to kind of consider when you're a business owner and you're first starting out. Well, how do I decide between an LLC or corporation, or can I just stick as a sole proprietorship? Well, there's no way to kind of judge that unless you kind of have some factors to kind of consider and compare and contrast. So in terms of the factors that I usually frequently encounter with business owners is cost and complexity. Is a lot of times business owners wonder whether it is with an attorney or without an attorney, is how much is this going to cost me to set up a business entity? can I just remain a sole proprietorship or a general partnership? And the thing is some people don't like paperwork. Obviously, attorneys and accountants, financial advisors, we're very used to paperwork, but other people not so much. And the question is how much is it going to cost to set up the business entity? And then is this really hard to maintain, or is this very complex to organize? So that's usually one set of factors. Usually, as you kind of already noticed me saying, is one of the biggest things that business owners tend to realize is, hey, I'm running this business. Am I going to be personally liable for what my business does? And the reason being is that if there's a lawsuit situation or issues with the business, are they going to come after the business owner? And so frequently the question is am I personally liable? And how is the best way to set myself up to deal with personal liability through a business entity? Another good kind of topic area in terms of decisions are income taxes. A lot of business owners, when it turns from the liability situation, well, what about taxes? How do I deal with it? And frequently for us business attorneys, we zero in on income taxes a lot, especially if you're working with an accountant. And the reason being is as your business grows, revenue and you're costing out expenses is, how do you get at the profit, and what are your tax liabilities and concerns going to be with that? And a lot of times you'll discover in terms of income taxes, really there's only really two choices, and we'll see how that plays out as I go through the business types of organizations. So the next one, flexibility. In terms of flexibility, the way to think about that, especially for me and the way I describe it, or I kind of get at it for business entities, is when you're working with business partners. And what I mean by that is people sometimes approach business and starting a business in all different ways. Sometimes your business partner is right there in the trenches with you and kind of in that owner operator mode of, yes, I'll open the store and you close the store, or I'll go to the market and buy the products and food, and you're the chef, so you're behind. And the thing is, that's not always the same relationship. Is that sometimes some people have more of a passive investor role, or this isn't my only business. I'm going to maybe spend only 10 or 20 or 30% of my week helping this business that I'm partnered with you, but I also have other businesses on the side. And so when I use the term flexibility, the question is there a way to structure this business organization in a way that meets the needs and the expectations of the various business owners? And how does that affect things like income taxes and kind of the cost and complexity? So that's kind of how I use flexibility. This one doesn't come up a lot because people don't tend to think about it. But right now in my practice, especially because of the pandemic, I'm seeing a lot of issues of what we call death and incapacity of business owners. And perpetuity means, does the business continue on after the business owner has passed on? Is the business entity separate in its existence and continues on after a business owner passes away? This is especially critical. And the reason why I bring up my kind of experience is this is especially critical for license and permit businesses that are regulated. So the question is a lot of times is a contractor, realtor, or let's say you have a liquor license, is it issued to a sole proprietorship or is it issued to a corporation? And this is it's a very key critical kind of decision to make, because if the business doesn't live on separate from its business owners, you're going to have issues with licensing and permitting. Finally, there's transferability and fundraising that I tie to, because a lot of times for businesses that are trying to raise capital, the question is it easy to transfer ownership? And a lot of times we'll see that in quote unquote selling stock or investment or shares in a corporation to then raise capital, but that's not the only way. And the thing is transferability kind of becomes key for fundraising, but also if you're selling a business, how transferable is the business over to somebody else? So in my practice, as I kind of just mentioned, I work with a lot of business owners who are deciding to exit their business, and the question is how do they do that? I know I kind of ran through that kind of fast. Does anybody have questions on those kind of factors? Like I said, kind of highbrow kind of things, but these are the things that go through a business attorney's head when they have somebody that comes into their office or does a Zoom for an initial consult of, this is my business, this is what I want, can you kind of help me set up my business organization? This is what runs through my head. Does anybody have questions on that? Nope. Okay, we're gonna move on then.
Oh, Ryan, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
With the last year's experience with COVID, has that taught us anything about this topic?
It has taught us that there are people here in Hawaii, and that's why I'm glad that you prompted this webinar series and the manual that will come along with it when everybody is done. I do definitely think there are business owners who have set themselves up to quote unquote fail less or transition better or pivot better in terms of a crisis. And there are definitely other business owners who don't take kind of these lessons and the content that we're going to be talking about to heart and definitely crash harder. So that, the thing is that, not all businesses succeed, and that's just kind of the reality. But the question is, as you saw in my earlier slide, or talking about liability or kind of structuring your business, have you taken steps to head off disasters or at least deal with disasters in a better way than somebody who hasn't planned for them? So I'll use a very simple example is, the question is for a business that can't make its rent or its liabilities for a commercial lease space, does the landlord have a personal guarantee? And we'll get into what that kind of means a little down, actually kind of in this slide. But I had a client who set their restaurant establishment as an LLC. The commercial landlord failed to kind of get personal guarantees, and so their recovery is limited just to the limited liability company. And they had wanted to just be a sole proprietorship at the beginning, but instead they did form an LLC. And so that's kind of crucial, is the rights of recovery of the landlord are just against the LLC. So that's one easy, really simple example. Contrast that to what I just talked about. I spent a significant time helping a realtor-based family business, so parent and child. And unfortunately, not because of COVID, the realtor parent passed on, but they had been operating as a sole proprietorship, and they were in the midst of trying to transfer business assets. Even though their child worked in the same office as them, they had been trying to transfer over clients and set up escrow accounts and stuff for their property management clients. And unfortunately, when they passed on and they hadn't set themselves up as an LLC or as a corporation for that perpetual kind of existence and sign the clients, everything kind of got flash frozen, their bank accounts, because it was all tied to the parent. So that would be the other extreme of not planning these things out and what it looks like.
So it sounds like the moral is don't be a sole proprietor ever.
Yeah, and we're gonna see that. We're gonna run through that.
Okay. We have a quick question in the chat,
sure.
Which is, if you're hiring people in Hawaii, but you primarily do business on the mainland, do you have to register the business in Hawaii?
That is an excellent question. I believe is there a webinar later on employment law? I'm gonna address it actually. One of my slides towards the end talks about.
There is. may not be dealing with this question though, is whether the business itself has to qualify to do business in Hawaii.
Um, sure. So I'll address it here now, but there will be another slide so we can also return to the conversation. But usually for attorneys in this question of, hey, so I work with a lot of social media and online people, and they're always saying, I operate everywhere and nowhere at once. And I'm like, but you're physically right here, and you have to have your files somewhere. So a lot of times the presence issue is a question for taxation purposes and liability purposes of where is this business truly operating. And frequently when I ask business owners, when they ask that question, is asking them back is, well, what are you doing here? And what are your workers or employees doing here? Thanks to the pandemic and obviously Silicon Valley's and major tech companies' response is they said, by all means, go remote workers. We have the Movers and Shoppers program here, and a lot of people have decided they want to, for the duration of the pandemic, be a software engineer in Hawaii. And so the question is how does that impact the business versus the employee? Most states would kind of look at how temporary it is, and others will tend to look is that if you avail yourself to the state, you have physical presence, you're operating in the state and you must register as a foreign business entity. So to answer your question that was asked by the audience, more often than not, if you're going to permanently be here, operate, have an office, even if it's a home office and you're running everything out of a Hawaii base of operations, yeah, more than likely you're going to have to register as a business entity in the state, whether you're coming from another state or you're starting in this state.
If I could add a few data points. Number one, registering in Hawaii isn't very complicated, difficult. It basically means that you can get sued here. So if it's a mainland company with Hawaii employees, then they register here. That means that there's jurisdiction over that company, which is the exchange you make for doing business here. Is you have to be subject to jurisdiction. Data point two is if you don't register, it's easy to register later, and you can actually cure it. The data point three is the downside of not registering here is you may not have the right to sue here, bring a lawsuit, but you can cure that by registering later. And data point number four is if you register here, sometimes the tax advisors don't like that if their position is you don't generate any Hawaii income and you're not going to pay Hawaii income tax. It's not exactly inconsistent with that, but it's evidence that you think you're generating revenue from the state. And so, those are just things to factor in as you think about this.
Yeah, Greg raises all exactly the points. Is that's a kind of decision about where to register. I think we have another question.
Yes. So I am a military spouse, a prior veteran myself, and I just registered for an LLC myself. I do plan on doing online business, but because I technically am exempt from Hawaii taxes, well, I'm non-resident technically here in the state of Hawaii, would I have to register here or in my home state for my LLC? Everything's online.
Right. So this is actually an excellent question. I get this question a lot because I have a number of military spouses who do what I call kind of online side business, or maybe it is your primary business or side hustle, or like while we're stationed here, I want to start a business or do something, with my time. And the question always is where do I register my business because we're going to move again? The unfortunate answer that I always tell people in this type of situation is there is no federal statute for forming or organizing a business. Businesses LLCs and corporations are registered at the state level. And so the thing is, unfortunately for military families that have to move around, they have to then make critical decisions of where they want to, what we call organize or domesticate their business. So if you have a domesticated corporation in Hawaii, it's a Hawaii corporation. If you move, the question then becomes is if I move to Texas, if I move to California and stuff like that, do I have to re-register my business and start all over again, or can I transfer my business? And the answer is yes to both those. So unfortunately, I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends. And it really depends on what kind of business you have and how easy it is to transfer and move around. But the reality is, for your specific question, income taxes, your personal income taxes, are a different matter than with regard to liability and jurisdiction questions about where you're owning and operating this business. Again, I usually turn to what a lot of state regulators tend to point at, even when you have online retailing businesses. Where is the business owner? Where are they conducting business? Even though it's online, they have to be somewhere. And the question is that, is all of that tied to you as a business owner? And are you operating out of your living room, your home office, or whatnot? And so more often than not, the answer is going to be, you should register in the business where you're physically present and kind of conducting affairs. With regard to the applicability of certain taxes, that is more of a tax analysis question. And which taxes are we talking about? As you may already know, because you're in the military, some states have sales tax, some don't. Hawaii has a general excise tax. That is a different kind of conversation about which taxes apply. And I believe there is a tax webinar, right, breakdown.
Yeah, so we're going to cover taxes. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could add to what Ryan said, is to some extent, it doesn't matter where you incorporate. So it's not worth probably worrying about too much, because, for example, a lot of companies incorporate in Delaware because they want to seek venture capital, but they're not located. No one, well, somebody must live in Delaware, but these startup companies are nowhere near Delaware. So my point is, you can incorporate in a state and do business anywhere else in the world. There's no problem with that. What you have to do is just qualify. If it's a Hawaii corporation and you say move to California, then you have to qualify it to do business in California, which is a very easy task. Sometimes people will want to incorporate in the state they plan to move to and retire or live in the long run. I think it's just mechanically easier to incorporate in a state you're living in, because you can walk down to the state office versus having to deal with them online or by mail. So, but I just wanted to set you at ease a bit to say, to a large extent, it doesn't matter where you incorporate from a business standpoint. It does matter in terms of how friendly those laws are when you are, say, a Hawaii LLC. Is the Hawaii LLC law pretty friendly? And I would say yes. Hawaii has a very fair, flexible law, but anyway, I just wanted to set you at ease a little bit on that.
Thank you.
Well, Ryan, we better move on, because you're on slide 7 of 20, and we better.
It's pretty short, but anyway, let me talk very briefly on limited liability. Well, you can't see it. Never mind. I drew out a little chart and then I realized, wait, I'm on white paper. Anyway, so the whole point of limited liability, liability for lawyers is you're responsible for the consequences of your actions or omissions. Now, omission is just not doing something. And so this becomes a concern for business owners, because if they're personally liable for their business's liabilities and obligations, it then puts their personal assets at risk. And usually that's one of the key reasons why to form an LLC and a corporation, you'll see. And the reason being is those entities have what we call as limited liability, which means the business owner is limited in their liability up to the amount they invested into the LLC or corporation. And that's a key critical thing to understand. The concept is basically the business entity is a separate person. It's not a living, breathing person like me and Greg. it's a separate entity unto itself that is responsible for its own liabilities, debts, and obligations. Now, the thing is when business owners first hear that, they're like, it's great, I can do anything and I'm not liable for anything at all. And I was like, no, that's not true. It's a very kind of limited situation in terms of what that means. And there are ways around it. You heard me mention the word personal guarantee. So banks and commercial landlords frequently are aware of the concept of limited liability. And those that are on it, unlike my example that I used earlier, make business owners sign a personal guarantee. That is a way around the limited liability shield. That's what we call it for LLCs and corporations. So just understand that this concept is important for your decision, but it's not a panacea to all the problems that would arise running a business in terms of what you're liable for.
Yeah, I like to tell people that, you know, if you own a restaurant and someone comes in and you punch them in the face, you can't say that was the LLC.
Yeah. So a lot of times it's limited in its effect for limited liability to a lot of things in contract and some tort law. But let's move along really quickly, basic types of organizations. So let's start off with the easiest and the simplest. And I like to use, well, we're here in Hawaii. I usually use the lemonade stand when I'm doing a more mainland oriented or a general presentation, but kahuku corn, like if you're just start selling corn on the side of the road, you're a sole proprietorship, there is no cost, there's no complexity. You are the business. You the business owner conducting and selling of products and services, that's it. You're a sole proprietorship. And in terms of income taxes, the business's profits and losses are directly taxed to the business owner. So people love it because they don't need to file anything. They don't need to register their sole proprietorship. It's just them selling stuff. A lot of people who go to the swap meet are probably sole proprietorships. The negative of that is there's no limited liability. It's just you, the business owner, and the business, and they're one and the same. They're not separated. There's no separate person concept there. I already kind of hinted at this too. Once the business owner, the sole proprietor, dies, the business doesn't exist anymore because it died basically along with them. That becomes a crucial concept for when you want to transfer in the next kind of con of, you can't really transfer business interest in a sole proprietorship because it's a person. It's just them. You only have assets. So in terms of investment opportunities or whatnot, you're really just giving a person money if you're trying to quote unquote invest in a sole proprietorship. So those are the issues of the sole proprietorship. And the biggest one is there's no limited liability, but it is the simplest because that's just you selling stuff.
Hey, Ryan, do you think there's ever a case where it would be better to be a sole proprietorship versus a single member LLC?
The only times that I can really truly think of that would be the case, and you're still going to have to enter the discussion of possibly picking up insurance coverage for whatever you're operating, is a very low risk business that basically, I would say, selling products or services that would not cause a lot of damage or injury to the consumer recipient or the person receiving the products and services.
I always ask this question of people that, you know, I meet with, and I haven't had one business yet where I couldn't come with a scenario where they could get sued.
That's what we attorneys love to do, is the outlandish hypothetical where everybody's injured, but it's true because it happens.
Well, not outlandish, but it's America. People sue when they have no good reason. And I think Ryan will cover single member LLCs later, but the beauty of it is that it's taxed just like a sole proprietorship. You don't have to do anything more, and yet you have the shield of the liability. So anyway,
exactly.
Put a pin down on that point, and you can move on. But when you get to LLCs, maybe you can emphasize that.
Yeah, Greg does bring a big point, and I think what I might add to this discussion of why I can talk a little bit about insurance and limited liability. Actually, my business partner is a personal injury attorney. Everybody's all like, how is a business lawyer partnered with a personal injury attorney? We're on the plaintiff side for his side of the practice. And I'm like, business owners are people too. They can get hit by buses, which is the actual case we had. So they have lost profits and damages against the bus company that hit them. But anyway, Greg does bring an excellent point about the reason why we still insist on limited liability and again, you guys may be sick of hearing me saying this, but Greg and Kat will go over how to form one. It's not that complicated to form. It is more complicated, right, versus the sole proprietorship or general partnership. The slide I'm on is you don't need to do anything paper-wise, but you'll find that at least for LLCs, the paperwork is very minimal. So in exchange for that limited liability. Moving on, general partnerships.
There's a question. Wouldn't a low volume MLM rep be pretty safe for sole proprietorship? I'm sorry, I don't know the acronym MLM. What is
multi-level marketing, I'm assuming.
Oh, gotcha. Well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you have to sign contracts, don't you? If you're in a program like that, and you could get sued. But the flip side is it's so cheap and easy to do a single member LLC that it's almost a no-brainer. You know, you don't need much of an operating agreement because you're not going to need to figure out how to make decisions with yourself. And so it's so easy. You can even just use your social security number for the tax ID if you wanted to. So I compare the risk against the cost. The cost is very low. And actually for someone in a multi-level marketing situation, I would think that people do make claims against each other at some point. So
yeah, they're going to be based on, you know, whether they're marketing or contract claims or whatnot. I agree with Greg, and I echo Greg is that you're going to discover, again, if you tune in next week, that the forming of an LLC is relatively simple. In exchange, you get the limited liability shield. And while I seem to downplay it a little, that actually, as I demonstrated, is actually really crucial because other businesses that do business with you don't always arm themselves with this knowledge. And so the thing is that for little effort down, a little kind of mental elbow grease for paperwork, you can get a limited liability shield, and it's better to, my estimation is it's better to have it than not have it. Segueing on, general partnerships are basically like sole proprietorships, but now we're dealing with two or more people. And what that basically means is, if in my example of person selling corn on the side of the road I grab Greg and say, let's sell corn on the side of the road. He's like, sure, we're partners. We're in a general partnership. There's no paperwork. We're just selling corn on the side of the road. The issue with that is, again, you're personally liable for the debts and liabilities of this corn selling business. The bigger issue for general partnerships is partners can legally bind the partnership without talking to the other partner. So in my scenario is that I tell Greg, let's start selling corn on the side of the road. While he's selling corn, I go out and make other business deals and say, oh yeah, sure, we'll buy on credit for supplies for hundreds, thousands of dollars. I bound the partnership to us, and I've also bound Greg without his explicit kind of acknowledgement to being bound on the debts and obligations of this partnership. So that's this kind of scary thing about just a general partnership with no paperwork at all, is that you just run out with two people running in opposite directions, even though they think they're on the same page. So that's the scary thing for general partnerships.
Yeah, I think if Ryan asked me to sell corn on the side of the road, I'd start worrying already. Number one. But number two, the main point is it's just like a sole proprietor. You have full liability, except you're liable for someone else too. And so that's why you never want to be a general partnership. If you can you can be an LLC.
And the last kind of point is same problem as sole proprietorship, but now you have 2 or more people to deal with. When one person dies, that's it for the partnership. It's gone. There's not so there's no perpetuity or perpetual existence. So same issues as the sole proprietorship. Now we're going to see that as I transition on is to the more formal business type of entities, ones that do require paperwork. So first up is C corporations. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think my materials cover this, but the main thing is C corporations do have limited liability. And usually what the relationship is, some type of founder or organizer has an idea and they seek investment from shareholders by basically exchanging stock for capital, money. And a lot of times, because of how C corporations are treated, they're very ideal for fundraising and for most people are deciding to go public at some point. And this is the vehicle used to get a lot of investment for investors. This isn't the point of today's webinar or this series because it's small business, but a lot of times there's a lot of regulation in terms of securities, a lot of taxation issues, and a lot of structuring for the C corporation. So they tend to be very hierarchical and complex if you're going that route. To form it, yes, compared to sole proprietorship and general partnerships, you have to file things with the state. You have to have agreements in place, bylaws, shareholder agreements. There's a lot of processes and paperwork that have to be met or that you should or have to be doing to kind of either comply or doing the best kind of practices for a C corporation. And so it's generally not a good idea for most very truly small business like retailers, online shopping, consultants, or things like that. That's not really what they're geared for. The other bigger con, so if you notice that we talked about for sole proprietorships and general partnerships, the C corporation has a double taxation situation. What that means is the corporation is taxed for its profits, and then usually as money comes out to the shareholders as dividends, that also gets taxed. Business owners generally don't like having to file a separate tax return from themselves for their corporation, and then also have that money coming out to them taxed again. And so a lot of times this is not a feature that most starting business owners want to do, is having to file a separate tax return for their corporation. And then as their money comes out to them in the form of dividends being taxed on that. So it's generally not a good, unless your intention is to seek venture capital, which Greg can talk to you all about and is an expert in kind of taking a private company to going public, this is not probably going to be the route for you. Okay, so we've arrived at one of the situations that probably is going to be the best fit for maybe I'd say, without even polling 90% of you, 99.
Ryan, just quick, there was a question in the chat. I just wanted to elaborate that.
Okay.
Can you fundraise if you don't have a C corporation? And the answer is yes. You can fundraise through an LLC where you can offer preferred equity. You can issue stock in an S corp for money, but that's harder because you can only have common stock. The C corporation is really the only time you want to be a C corporation is if you're going to be a high growth company seeking venture capital. Otherwise, it's a big price to pay to have that double tax to be a C corporation. And there's one fallacy I always hear, which is, well, I want to be big, so I need to be a C corporation. There's no limit on how big you can get if you're an LLC. For example, I assume that for L&L Drive-In is not a C corporation because it's owned by Eddie Flores and he doesn't want to pay more taxes than he needs to. And so he's probably an LLC or an S corporation. So there is no limit on how big you can get if you're not a C corporation. You don't have to be a regular corporation.
Greg is absolutely right, which is why a lot of people, when they're first starting out, like the LLC's flexibility. It can do same thing as a corporation in some ways. There are a lot of LLCs that are very big LLCs. The only reason you don't hear about them is they're private companies. The only reason, well, not the only reason, the major reason for a C corporation is exactly that is the vehicle that institutional investors, fundraisers, and people seeking to go public is the vehicle that you're going to choose. But there is nothing stopping an LLC from, in fact, there are probably LLCs larger than very small public corporations. It's just that the owners have decided to keep everything private. LLCs. So, good segue for LLCs is that they have the limited liability of a corporation, but in addition, they have the simplicity of sole proprietorships and general partnerships, meaning that for income tax purposes, LLCs, as compared to a corporation, do not file a separate income tax return. That is, all you do is you get a schedule that attaches from the monies or received or lost on the business endeavor to your income tax return. You're going to get more into that in the tax thing, but I just wanted to flag that is that's why it has the similar simplicity or the flatness of sole proprietorships and general partnerships. In addition to that question that was asked and Greg kind of answered is, yeah, LLCs are highly flexible entities. They're not rigid and structured like C corporations. Is there a question, Greg?
Oh, there was a question about if you're not going to raise money, do you advise against being a C corp? And my response is, I can't think of a reason you'd want to be a C corporation if you're not fundraising, especially from venture capitalists, and you're going to generate profits. Then why do you want to give the government more of your money by being a C corporation? It's you can be an LLC or an S corporation. Better.
Exactly. Greg is right about that situation. And on that note, yeah, LLCs there's no double taxation again on that situation, what I'm talking about. And all of those three first points are kind of tied together, that there's less paperwork compared to a corporation. There's slightly more paperwork than a sole proprietorship and a general partnership. Again, next week's kind of talk. But what I find for people who are partnering, they really appreciate an LLC's flexibility. That is, members, that's the term we use for owners of an LLC. They can allocate profit and loss from the LLC differently from their ownership interests. So let's say you have two partners, business partners in an LLC, two members, and they're 50-50. They can agree to a different structure for their profit and loss allocation. It doesn't have to be 50-50. You could not do the same thing with a corporation because it's based on shareholders, and that's the rigidity that I was alluding to, that LLCs don't have. You have flexibility. So oftentimes in my practice, I see a lot of times, as I kind of mentioned, is that there is a business owner who's going to be a little bit more passive or less invested in the LLC, but still bringing something of value, maybe investors, maybe connections. And so the partners in the LLC, the members, have decided to divvy up the pot basically different than their ownership interests.
Hey, Ryan, I need to push you, but we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, so moving along, con-wise, LLC, yes, it's slightly more costly, but it's only slightly more costly. And that's because you have to file paperwork. And again, Greg and Kat will talk about that next week. One of the biggest things that I have for people who are first-time LLC owners, yes, the terminology that we use can be a lot of confusing. And if you're going from what I call from a W-2 kind of employee kind of status to being your first-time business owner, a lot of times without the aid of an accountant or somebody to kind of navigate basic tax, self-employment taxes of when you file your first kind of tax or estimated earnings can be kind of very confusing. So sometimes, in this case, you may need to turn to, if it's your very, very first LLC, of getting a little bit of that minimal help to kind of roadmap what you need to do to maintain and kind of pay your taxes with respect to the monies gained or lost for LLC. One con about the flexibility, and I find this in business partnership situations, is to set up a proper operating agreement tied to this terminology thing. There's a lot of back and forth between members of the LLCs that they can get into what I call light arguments about what should go in the operating agreement. Dropping down to S corporations. In terms of S corporations, they're very similar to LLCs in the sense that the shareholders have pass-through status and are treated basically like partners if you have multiple shareholders. That is, there is no C corporation, there's no corporation to tax for that double taxation. Because all it really is, and actually what some people don't realize is that LLCs can also make an S election, is the business owners have elected to be taxed under subchapter S. And all that confers to the shareholders is like this pass-through status. The issue though is, as Greg kind of already alluded to, there's a lot of restrictions on who can be a shareholder for an S corporation, which is why S corporations kind of have fallen out of favor as a way of a small business as compared to just a regular LLC. That is, you're not filing this S election with the IRS about how to be treated. But as an example of one of the restrictions, and Greg already mentioned this, you can have only one class of stock in an S corporation. That's not the case with an LLC, is that very much like a C corporation, you can offer different levels of stock. So that's one of the many examples of there's other restrictions, like, again, we're talking about small businesses, but you can't have more than 100 shareholders. So I don't know, probably many of you are going to have more than 100 shareholders, but that's another restriction. The other issue is that the shareholders must be living, breathing people, individuals. So there's no trusts or entities or other organizations that can be a shareholder. In an LLC, sometimes you get somebody who is an LLC or a corporation, and they gives you money to run your LLC. You can do that. You can have partners who are business entities. So those are a lot of the cons of the S corporation. The only time that there's a consideration to be an S corporation has a lot to do with the self-employment taxes, and I'm going to let the tax webinar touch upon that, because that's a very kind of in-depth discussion. So frequently, I do get a question for all those different types of business organizations. Hey, if I don't like being an LLC, can I become a corporation later? Or, as Greg kind of asked, if I start out as a sole proprietorship, can I be a single member LLC later? And the answer is yes. You could do a conversion event. It's usually easier to go from simple to complex. So it's easier to jump over from sole proprietorship to single member because of the paper requirements. It's usually ill-advised to go the other direction and become less complex. For instance, the biggest one being a C corporation and then converting into an LLC. The reason being is there are tax considerations. But it is for this simple reason why I feel that the LLC in its flexibility has the most kind of options of which direction it goes. As I mentioned in the previous slide, LLCs can elect for an S corporation status. It's just a timing kind of issue, and mostly we tie it to the formation. But that's usually about when the S election kicks in. LLCs can change their tax status. They can convert into a corporation at a later date. I've seen people do that. It's, again, out of the business entities, you would have noticed that LLCs tend to use that flexibility to best effect for small business owners who want to grow or remain small. It's the best kind of vehicle with that limited liability situation. I think there's another question.
No, I was just for any final
I
question.
want to.
Oh, here we go.
let me do the
Businesses-
last two slides, and then
Yeah, why don't we?
I'm happy to remain for extra questions because I'm sure there's a lot.
Okay.
You'll notice that for today's discussion, I didn't cover limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships. I myself am in a limited liability partnership with my business partner. Those are different than general partnerships, and they do require paperwork. They have mostly fallen out of favor in use, which is why I didn't discuss them. Today's discussion also was focused on small businesses for profit, but if you have a charitable kind of purpose, a nonprofit corporation is probably the route to go. And that's usually because you're seeking some type of tax exemption status for your purpose. Like I want to donate funds to children, or I want to help my community with a rec center or something like that. Finally, for those of you who are professionals, yes, there are professional types of entities or professional corporations. That is generally entities for owners that have to be all the same profession. So doctors, as an example. Those are other forms of business. I didn't cover them because that's not the main focus of today's discussion. I think for most people listening or viewing this. This is the slide we kind of spent discussion way back when on the limited liability side. If you are operating in Hawaii and you've domesticated your business in another state, yes, as Greg has already mentioned, you would have to do a foreign business entity filing to operate in this state. One practical note about that, what I've seen is somebody has maybe incorporated or organized their LLC in another state, but then they go to the Bank of Hawaii, American Savings Bank, or any of the other local banks. They're going to ask you to see, oh, did you register your business in the state of Hawaii to do business, to open this business bank account here in these local banks? So that's one kind of practical note about when you try and locate your business entity in another state. Okay, I'm now ready for questions. Sorry for going over, but I'm happy to entertain as many of them to kind of get everybody.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I will say a few words and then we'll open up to questions, and people can hang around if they'd like. Ryan's very generously agreed to stick around. But thanks for attending this. We will send a reminder each week of the upcoming webinar. Since you registered for this one, you will likely get the reminder. And we do ask people to register for each webinar separately so we have an idea of the head count. But you will get a reminder and you're welcome to join. And as before, you know, as with today, we'll share the webinar materials during the session. So thank you again for coming. And with that, I'll open up to questions.
Oh, before that, just really quick plug too. Just remember, Business Law Corps, we attorneys do pro bono in 30-minute consults through Patsy Team Inc. and HTDC. It's weekly every Wednesday, right, Greg?
That's right. We switch forth. We go to the Entrepreneur Sandbox every other time as well.
So don't forget, if you miss out or if we go too long or if there's other questions you have, you can always also sign up for that.
And also, you can visit our website, and I'll put it in the chat, businesslawcorps.org, for other information, for forms of LLC agreements, for other, you can actually even apply for free pro bono assistance. So I'll put that in the, I'll put that link there in the chat.
So we're all here for restarting Hawaii and getting you kind of.
Oh, sorry, I misspelled it. But yeah.
Anyway, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that there are still other avenues to help you all out, even if we can't get to everything today.
Okay, with that, feel free to check out if you need to, but a few questions came up. If your business is registered in Delaware, do you also need to register in Hawaii or another state where you'll be doing business? And I think the answer to that is yes. You have to register in every state where you're doing business. A lot of companies do state business in multiple states. So if I don't answer the question, or Ryan, you have something to add, please feel free to jump in.
Greg is right. Greg is absolutely right. So for those large corporations like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, if you go to whatever state's business registry site, you will find that really large corporations that are doing business have registered in all 50 states because they're doing business in all 50 states.
Hey, Ryan, a question came up. Are you willing to share your PowerPoint with the group?
Yes, my understanding, and Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, is he actually is going to aggregate all of everybody's from my webinar to the last, the 8th webinar into kind of like a manual or kind of like a packet of materials.
Yeah, I am going to do that, but I will share it right now because we're not going to share that till the webinar series is over. So for people,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
they can get these materials as they go. So I'll go ahead and put that in the drop. I just converted it to a PDF to make it easier to share. And I'm going to put that in the chat shortly. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Danny Schneider. I wanted to ask a follow-up question on my question about the Delaware. So you answered that piece of it. So basically, here's my situation. So we registered the business in Delaware while we were living in California, and then we relocated to Hawaii. So right now, I just re-registered in Delaware just because it was due, but then I also need to now register it in Hawaii. My bank account is in California. So what's the easiest, do I need like a personalized consultation to figure out how to navigate this and register it in Hawaii? Because I do want to set it up. I've recently started talking to investors to raise a seed round. And so I just want to make sure that I'm set up properly where I could raise money in Hawaii.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That terms of there's securities, tax, and operate. That's going to be more of a personalized. Unless Greg has like the short bottom line answer here, I think there's a lot going on in that scenario.
I'm sorry.
So can I talk
Could
to one
you-
of you guys directly?
Could you repeat that question again? I was kind of focusing on the PowerPoint.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so I registered my business in Delaware last year. It was started in 2020, and I have a bank account in California where we used to live. So then we just recently relocated to Hawaii, and I re-registered it in Delaware because the bill was basically due, so I wanted to maintain the entity. And so now my plan is to register in Hawaii because I'm planning on hiring in Hawaii and potentially doing business in Hawaii, but primarily it is an online business. So it'd be doing business primarily in Silicon Valley and all over. So I guess my question is, I'm also trying to see if I could raise some seed money from Hawaii. And so I'm just trying to kind of navigate it and figure out what paperwork do I need to fill out for this year. And besides registering for Hawaii, should I change it from LLC to corporation? Should I continue having it as LLC registered in Delaware and in Hawaii, or do I not need the registration in Delaware anymore?
So when you say registered in Delaware, is that where you formed it under Delaware law?
Yes.
Oh, well,
Yes.
it's not easy to change that. Once you form, you're gonna have to basically convert it to another state. And I don't see any compelling reason to do that. Whether you should convert it to a Delaware corporation, that's an important question. Like Ryan said earlier, if you're a corporation, it's harder to convert back to the LLC. So I wouldn't do that without thinking a lot about it. I wouldn't do the corporation unless you're going to seek traditional venture capital, and you're going to become $100 million company. If you are still you can raise money in LLC from, high net worth people and even companies, but you're not going to be able to go public. And so that's really the decision making that you have to make. What kind of opportunity are you giving investors? Is it $100 million opportunity, or just make lots of money, but you're not necessarily going to become world dominant?
Not anytime soon on the world dominance question.
Well, you can always convert to a corporation later if you're going to try to pursue world domination. But if you convert to it today, it's going to be hard to go back to less than world domination. You're going to have to probably pay taxes to convert back to the LLC.
Yeah, if you're going from world domination, thinking that's too big, and you're just going to go for island domination, it's harder to scale make your company smaller than bigger.
I think the investors will tell you, even the angel investors have this idea that they only want to invest in Delaware C corporations. And I think that's harmful to the companies because sometimes it's not the right entity to be. But I think part of the answer is, what do your investors want? If they don't care whether you're an LLC, then I don't know that you should care.
I do want to touch upon one of the other, you mentioned that you're hiring workers. Are they physically here in Hawaii? Is that what you said?
So I'm physically in Hawaii, yeah.
But your workers are employees?
So they are actually just contractors. So I'm kind of testing out this concept of fractional teams. So everybody is part-time, kind of like freelancer basis.
Okay,
And so
okay. I would recommend, and I think one of the later webinars is, there's one on independent contractors versus employees. Yes. Greg?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm responding to some chat here.
Oh, sorry. I don't have the flyer, but I believe, so for that situation, let's see. Yeah.
Ryan, just to let you know, we do have a speaker series. I believe it's our 7th or 8th one called Get Workers, How to Hire Employees and Independent Contractors, and then addressing the difference between the two.
Yeah,
so
Annie, you probably would want to follow up with that too, because yeah, frequently for a lot of small business owners who need help or starting or are growing, they try and put workers into the category of independent contractors because they feel it would be less risk, or they'll be liable for less because they don't need to provide the benefits to independent contractors. But there are some key critical factors and variables in deciding if this is truly an employee or an independent contractor. So you probably want to follow up with that April 15th webinar.
Yeah, thank you.
I put a link to our flyer for the entire series in the chat, and I think it's the current one, but it shows you all the topics, which is also posted in Eventbrite. When you register, you can go back and take a look at the topics. You know.
Are there any other questions?
I think you exhausted them.
Oh, thank goodness! You all want to rush off to lunch. I do too until.
But no,
I probably won't be able to eat till 1 or 2. But anyway.
No, great job, Ryan. I think you covered a lot of ground, answered a lot of great questions. This will be really useful content going forward. And we will post these recordings in the future, probably after the webinar series is done with the materials. So thank everyone for coming. And
just pitching and join Greg and Kat next week. We talked about all the as I said, highbrow, broad stroke kind of things. In terms of the nitty gritty of removing or lessening us attorneys from the equation, they're going to get into the actual, these are the forms or how you form your LLC. Because I think what you should gather from this conversation is most of you will probably consider the LLC as your vehicle of choice. Maybe one or I don't know your specific situation, and I've given you some kind of tools to kind of navigate that. But yeah, Greg and Kat will. And then all the other webinars are great other attorneys, and they'll cover things about marketing for brand protection, how to raise money if you're going that route, compliance issues with state agencies, because Hawaii's agencies don't always lend themselves to being readily perceptible for those licenses and permits. And yes, there will be tax and then commercial leasing at the end. So there's content for everybody wherever you are in the stage of your business. So I highly recommend checking out the Eventbrite link.
well, let's give Ryan a virtual hand. Yay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Ryan, for that. And you've set us up well for our series, and appreciate your donating your time.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing and being the platform, Greg.
Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you again in the future, I hope.
Good luck and stay healthy and safe.